February 14th, 1943. Central Tunisia. The hour sits just before dawn. Cold air presses low against the ground, trapped beneath a sky without color. Engines idle in disciplined intervals, their vibrations felt more than heard. Steel hulls creak as they cool. Condensation gathers on periscopes and freezes in thin, uneven rings. Men breathe through scarves, careful not to waste heat. No one speaks. Across the shallow rises and dry wadis, silhouettes hold their shape in the dark. They have been reported, cataloged, dismissed. According to Berlin, there is little reason to expect armor here. Infantry, perhaps. Trucks. Disorganization. Anything heavy would have been noted. Anything dangerous would have been known. Maps say the terrain is permissive. Intelligence summaries say the enemy lacks tanks in meaningful numbers. Staff officers have repeated it often enough that it no longer sounds like an assessment. It sounds like fact. Somewhere to the west, a column adjusts its spacing. Tracks bite into frozen soil. A hatch closes with a dull metallic knock, too loud in the quiet. Inside, hands settle on controls. Turrets remain forward. Guns stay cold. The war, at this hour, feels suspended, as if it has paused to confirm its assumptions. No one in these positions believes they are about to correct Berlin. No one imagines that the next movement, barely minutes away, will erase months of certainty, redraw expectations, and force a reckoning written not in reports, but in burning fuel and twisted steel. The engines continue to idle. History has not moved yet. Strategic blindness. By early 1943, the German war effort was already carrying the weight of its own assumptions. The campaigns in Poland and France had hardened a belief that speed, coordination, and initiative could compensate for material imbalance. Intelligence failures in those early victories were interpreted not as warnings, but as proof that German doctrine rendered enemy capacity irrelevant. When opponents collapsed quickly, the cause was not examined closely. Success had simplified the explanation. The United States entered the war carrying the burden of that simplification. From Berlin, America appeared distant, industrially unfocused, politically divided, and militarily inexperienced. German military attaches in the interwar years had described American armored forces as underdeveloped and doctrinally confused. Those assessments, accurate in the late 1930s, were never fully updated. The speed with which the United States could adapt was not part of the model. German intelligence culture reinforced this blindness. The Abwehr collected vast quantities of data, but analysis was filtered through expectations shaped by early victories and ideological bias. Reports that suggested rapid American production were treated cautiously. Claims of mass-standardized armored output were regarded as optimistic extrapolation rather than measurable reality. Intelligence that contradicted existing conclusions rarely altered them. The Wehrmacht's planning staffs worked from these conclusions. In Africa, where distance already distorted perception, the problem deepened. Shipping losses in the Atlantic were believed to cap American deployment. Port capacity in North Africa was considered a limiting factor. Training deficiencies observed in early U.S. ground units were taken as permanent traits rather than transitional weaknesses. German field commanders in Tunisia received summaries that framed the American presence as immature and thin. They were told to expect poorly coordinated infantry supported by light armor at best. Heavy formations were not anticipated in strength. Tank numbers, when mentioned, were described as insufficient for sustained armored operations. This belief shaped planning at every level. Reserve allocations were made accordingly. Anti-tank defenses were positioned to counter British patterns, not American ones. The assumption was not that American armor did not exist, but that it would not matter. That distinction mattered, because in war, what is dismissed is often more dangerous than what is unknown. The German High Command had learned to respect British armor through costly experience. Soviet mass and resilience had been acknowledged, if not fully understood. The Americans, by contrast, were categorized before they were encountered. Their doctrine was judged in absence. Their industrial capacity was measured by peacetime standards. Their soldiers were evaluated without time. By the winter of 1942 to 43, this assessment had hardened into doctrine. It was no longer a question asked. It was an answer repeated. And as German formations maneuvered through central Tunisia, confident that they understood the enemy ahead, the first consequences of that certainty were already forming. Quietly, far from Berlin, in factories, ports, and training grounds that German intelligence had failed to fully see. The distance between assumption and reality was closing, and it was closing fast, reality forming across the Atlantic. While German intelligence refined its conclusions, the United States was already moving beyond them. In 1940, American armor doctrine was fragmented and contested. Tanks were still viewed primarily as infantry support weapons by some branches, while others argued for independent armored formations. Training was inconsistent. Equipment was limited. The assessments reaching Berlin at that time were not entirely wrong. They were simply outpaced by events. The turning point was industrial, not theoretical. After the fall of France, American planners accepted that any future war would be decided by scale. In June 1940, the U.S. Army activated its armored force as a distinct branch. Within months, design, production, and training were aligned toward a single requirement: rapid, standardized output that could be deployed overseas without delay. Factories were retooled at unprecedented speed. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant began mass production in 1941, producing M3 medium tanks in quantities previously unseen in American military history. Design compromises were accepted in exchange for speed. Armor was riveted instead of welded. Guns were mounted in sponsons before turrets could be perfected. None of it was elegant. All of it was deliberate. The M3 Lee was not designed to defeat German armor on paper. It was designed to exist in numbers. By the time the M4 Sherman followed in 1942, American production had already achieved momentum. Standardization became doctrine. Components were interchangeable. Repair was prioritized over perfection. Engines were selected for availability rather than sophistication. The result was a vehicle that could be shipped, maintained, and replaced faster than its opponents expected. Training followed production. Large-scale maneuvers in the United States revealed weaknesses: command rigidity, poor gunnery under stress, coordination failures. These were documented, not concealed. Doctrine evolved under pressure, informed by British combat experience in North Africa and hard lessons learned in exercises that openly acknowledge failure. None of this registered clearly in Berlin. German intelligence focused on performance characteristics: armor thickness, gun caliber, silhouette. They missed the system. They did not fully account for throughput. They underestimated replacement rates. They dismissed the implications of an economy not yet under bombardment. By late 1942, American armored units were shipping to North Africa with vehicles fresh from factory lines, crews trained under revised doctrine, and logistical support designed to sustain continuous operations. Port limitations slowed deployment, but did not stop it. Each convoy that arrived quietly eroded German assumptions. The early encounters between American and German units were uneven. Tactical mistakes confirmed existing prejudices. Losses were interpreted as proof of inferiority rather than evidence of inexperience under fire. German reports emphasized American errors, not American resilience. What those reports did not emphasize was how quickly those errors were corrected. As winter settled over Tunisia, American armored formations were no longer theoretical. They were present, refueled, and integrated into operational plans. Their numbers were sufficient. Their crews were learning fast. Their commanders were beginning to adapt. The moment when Berlin's intelligence model would collide with this reality was no longer distant. It was imminent, and it would arrive not as a report, but as contact. For the American tank crews arriving in North Africa, the weight of underestimation was not abstract. Most had trained in heat, dust, and repetition, far from enemy fire. Their understanding of German armor came from manuals, silhouettes, and second-hand accounts. They knew they were considered inexperienced. They also knew that reputation would not stop shells. Inside the tanks, space was tight and air stale. Ammunition was stacked wherever it fit. Radios crackled unevenly, sensitive to movement and interference. Crews learned each other's habits in motion. How quickly a driver responded, how a loader worked under stress, how a commander judged distance through imperfect optics. What they did not know was that their presence itself was unexpected. The first movements into contested terrain were cautious. Tanks advanced not as symbols of power, but as tools still being tested. Mistakes were immediate and costly. Vehicles exposed themselves too long. Formations lost cohesion. Some crews paid with their lives before understanding why. But the learning curve was brutal and fast. Survivors adapted within hours, not weeks. They adjusted spacing. They learned when to halt, when to press, when to rely on supporting arms. Losses did not break units. They hardened them. Replacement crews arrived not to restore old methods, but to absorb new ones. German fire destroyed tanks. It did not destroy resolve. The human reality on the American side was not one of confidence, but of urgency. They understood that every engagement was being observed, not only by the enemy, but by their own command. Performance mattered beyond survival. It would shape how they were used, where they were committed, and whether assumptions about them would persist. Men climbed back into burning machines because the alternative was retreat without understanding. And understanding, in this war, had to be earned under fire. That human pressure formed the foundation of what followed. Angle 2. The tactical reality. 250 to 300 words. German tactical planning in Tunisia rested on predictability. Panzer commanders expected British-style deployments, deliberate, methodical, supported by artillery preparation. Against American forces, they anticipated even less sophistication. This expectation shaped initial engagements. Anti-tank guns were placed to cover likely approaches, not depth. Armored reserves were held back under the assumption that enemy armor would not attempt sustained thrusts. Reconnaissance focused on infantry movement, not armored concentration. When American tanks appeared in strength, the response lagged. Initial contact reports were questioned. Numbers were rechecked. Sightings were attributed to exaggeration. Commanders hesitated to commit reserve against what was assumed to be a limited threat. That hesitation cost time. American formations, imperfect but present, exploited the gap. Tanks advanced beyond what German planners believed they would attempt. They pressed through areas considered safe for maneuver. Even when tactically clumsy, their willingness to continue movement disrupted German fire plans. The tactical surprise was not brilliance. It was persistence. German doctrine emphasized destroying enemy armor with combined arms. But doctrine depends on accurate anticipation. When American tanks appeared where they were not expected, the system fractured. Anti-tank guns found themselves outflanked. Infantry units reported being engaged by armor they were told would not be there. The battlefield became uneven, not through innovation, but through misalignment between expectation and reality. German commanders adjusted, but adjustments came mid-engagement, not before it. Orders issued under pressure lacked clarity. Coordination suffered. Tactical confidence eroded. By the time German units recognized that American armor was not a fleeting presence, the engagement had already moved beyond its planned shape. The battlefield had shifted, and it would not return to the assumptions that had defined it. German assessments of American tanks focused on comparison, not context. On paper, early American medium tanks were inferior. Their armor was thinner. Their silhouettes were taller. Their guns, particularly in early models, lacked penetration against late-model German panzers at range. These facts were correct and misleading. What German intelligence underestimated was integration. American tanks were designed to be maintained in the field. Engines could be replaced quickly. Tracks were standardized. Mechanical failures, expected in any armored force, did not remove vehicles permanently. Damaged tanks returned to service faster than anticipated. Communications, though imperfect, were widespread. Radios were standard equipment, not command luxuries. This allowed American units to coordinate movement even when formations broke under fire. German doctrine valued radio use, but did not expect it at scale among American units. Perhaps most critically, American production ensured continuity. Losses did not hollow out formations. They triggered replacement. A tank destroyed was not a strategic concern. It was a logistical problem with an answer already in motion. German tank crews encountered American armor repeatedly, not as isolated incidents, but as recurring obstacles. Vehicles they believed destroyed reappeared. Units they thought depleted returned with new equipment and unfamiliar tactics. The technological shock was not about superiority. It was about endurance. American tanks kept coming back, and each return forced German commanders to revise their calculations under pressure rather than at leisure. Technology, misunderstood, had become a strategic weight, one that German intelligence had not accounted for. The disconnect between Berlin and the front widened with each engagement. Field commanders in Tunisia began to report encounters that did not align with pre-war intelligence assessments. They describe American armor operating in greater numbers than expected, appearing repeatedly after losses, and integrating more effectively with infantry than initial reports suggested. These messages traveled upward through command channels shaped by hierarchy and expectation. In Berlin, the reception was muted. Senior staff officers viewed the reports as situational anomalies. Tunisia was considered a secondary theater. Deviations there did not warrant immediate doctrinal revision. The focus remained fixed on the Eastern Front, where German armor faced existential pressure. Africa, by comparison, seemed peripheral. This prioritization slowed acknowledgement. Field commanders were instructed to adapt locally, not challenge foundational assumptions. Requests for additional anti-tank assets were weighed against larger strategic needs. Warnings were filed, not acted upon. The front was expected to manage with what it had. Leadership friction emerged in the space between urgency and belief. German officers at the front adjusted tactics in isolation. They concentrated fire. They increased reconnaissance. They treated American armor with growing caution. But these adaptations were not reinforced institutionally. Each unit learned independently, without the benefit of coordinated doctrine or reinforcement. The result was inconsistency. Some formations adapted quickly. Others clung to outdated expectations. When these units fought alongside each other, coordination suffered. Confidence varied. Trust eroded. Leadership, distant from consequence, remained insulated by reports that confirmed prior conclusions. The field, exposed to reality, bore the cost of delay. By the time Berlin began to recognize that its assumptions required revision, the initiative had already begun to shift. Leadership had not failed through neglect. It had failed through certainty. Angle 5. Enemy miscalculation. 250 to 300 words. Miscalculation in war rarely appears as a single error. It accumulates. German intelligence did not believe Americans had no tanks. It believed they had no meaningful armored threat. That distinction allowed evidence to be absorbed without altering conclusions. Small encounters were discounted. Losses were rationalized. Exceptions were framed as temporary. This cognitive narrowing shaped operational decisions. When American armored units maneuvered aggressively, German commanders interpreted it as recklessness rather than intent. When tanks advanced without perfect coordination, it was seen as confirmation of incompetence, not as a stage of adaptation. Each American failure reinforced confidence. Each American success was contextualized away. The danger of this approach lay in its resilience. Beliefs built on early impressions resist change. They shape how information is interpreted. They define which data matters and which is ignored. German intelligence, accustomed to early war success, had learned to trust its instincts. But instincts are brittle when conditions change. The American war effort was not static. It evolved under pressure. German miscalculation assumed stasis where there was motion. It mistook initial weakness for permanent limitation. By the time evidence accumulated beyond dismissal, the cost of revision had increased. Adjusting doctrine mid-campaign demands resources, time, and attention, all scarce commodities in 1943. Miscalculation, left uncorrected, became momentum. And momentum carried German forces toward engagements they were not prepared to fight on their own terms. Angle 6, psychological strain. 250 to 300 words. 4 German soldiers. Expectation shaped experience. They entered engagements believing they understood the enemy. This belief provided confidence. It reduced uncertainty. When reality diverged, the psychological impact was immediate. Encountering American armor in strength disrupted mental frameworks. Tanks appeared where they were not supposed to be. Units thought dispersed, re-engaged. Firepower was sustained beyond anticipated limits. These moments created hesitation, not from fear, but from recalculation under fire. Recalculation consumes time. German crews, trained for decisiveness, found themselves reassessing assumptions mid-engagement. Orders were questioned. Reports were repeated. Confirmation was sought when none could be spared. This internal friction slowed response. Confidence eroded unevenly. Veteran units adjusted faster, drawing on experience from other fronts. Less experienced formation struggled. The disparity increased strain within mixed formations, where trust and shared understanding is essential. Psychological pressure also traveled upward. Officers responsible for outcomes they could not explain faced scrutiny. Failures were attributed to execution rather than intelligence, increasing tension between levels of command. For American crews, being underestimated became a source of grim motivation. For German crews, being surprised by that underestimation became a liability. War punishes those who believe it has already revealed itself. And in Tunisia, German certainty fractured not in a single moment, but across many, each leaving behind hesitation, doubt, and delay. The stage was set. The confrontation that would force acknowledgement was approaching. February 14th to 18th, 1943, Central Tunisia, Sidi Bouzid sector. The break came in stages, not in a single strike. At first light, on February 14th, German forces began their movement towards Sidi Bouzid. The plan, formulated by General Oberst Hans-Jürgen von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army, called for a coordinated attack to disrupt American positions and seize ground before Allied forces could consolidate. It was an offensive shaped by confidence in maneuver superiority and skepticism toward American armored capability. Elements of the 10th Panzer Division and 21st Panzer Division advanced along converging axes. Reconnaissance indicated dispersed American units occupying elevated terrain, isolated positions believed vulnerable to encirclement. The Americans were positioned around Sidi Bouzid under the command of Major General Lloyd Fredendall's 2 Corps. Their deployment reflected caution and inexperience. Units were spread across hills and ridgelines, separated by distance and poor communication. German planners saw opportunity. What they did not see clearly was density. As German columns advanced, American armor began to move, not in isolated packets, but in formations sufficient to contest ground. M3 Lees and M4 Shermans emerged from concealment, engines warming rapidly, turrets traversing. The first engagements were uneven. German Panzer III and IV crews used superior gunnery and positioning to score early hits. American tanks burned. Crews bailed out under fire. Reports flowed back to German headquarters confirming expectations, initially. Then the contacts multiplied. American armored units continued to appear beyond the first line. Tanks pushed forward to relieve isolated infantry. Others maneuvered laterally, forcing German units to redeploy anti-tank guns under pressure. The battlefield expanded beyond the narrow focus of the initial plan. By mid-morning, German commanders recognized that American armor was not a minor presence. It was sufficient to complicate the encirclement. Orders were adjusted. Reserves were committed sooner than planned. Timing slipped. American resistance, though costly, delayed German momentum. Each delay allowed additional U.S. units to enter the fight. Tanks previously thought destroyed were replaced. Positions once considered cleared became contested again. The German attack pressed on, but the tempo changed. What was expected to be a rapid collapse became a grinding engagement. And grinding engagements favor those who can replace losses. By February 15th, German units had achieved tactical success, overrunning positions, destroying vehicles, forcing withdrawals. But the price was higher than anticipated. Reports now spoke of sustained armored opposition, not fleeting resistance. The realization began to surface quietly. American tanks were present in numbers that intelligence had not prepared them for. The consequences of that realization would become unavoidable. And the fighting was only beginning. February 15 to 18, 1943, from Sidi Bou Zid to Kasserine. By the afternoon of February 15th, the engagement had outgrown its original objectives. German formations, having broken through initial American positions around Sidi Bou Zid, pushed westward with the intent of exploiting success. The expectation was that American resistance, already disorganized, would dissolve under continued pressure. Instead, it thickened. As German columns advanced toward the Kasserine Pass, they encountered American armor again, reconstituted, repositioned, and increasingly coordinated. Tanks appeared along routes assumed to be unsecured. Road junctions were contested. Supply lines came under threat from armored probes rather than infantry alone. Command friction intensified. German units reported armor-heavy engagements that contradicted intelligence summaries still circulating. Some commanders adapted aggressively, massing anti-tank fire and maneuvering panzers defensively. Others continued offensive thrusts under the assumption that resistance was temporary. The lack of a unified adjustment fractured momentum. At Kasserine, terrain compressed movement. Passes narrowed. Elevation limited maneuver. American tanks, though suffering losses, used numbers to delay and channel German advances. Each hour gained allowed additional Allied forces to reinforce. On February 17th, German attacks met increasingly stiff resistance. Artillery coordination improved on the American side. Infantry-tank cooperation, initially poor, showed visible correction. German armored spearheads encountered prepared positions rather than improvised ones. Losses mounted. German commanders recognized that they were no longer facing a force defined by inexperience alone. American armor was absorbing punishment and returning fire consistently. Units destroyed on one day were replaced by fresh formations the next. The expected operational collapse did not occur. By February 18th, the limits of German advance became clear. Fuel shortages, extended supply lines, and rising Allied resistance forced a halt. Orders shifted from exploitation to consolidation. The initiative ebbed. The turning point was not a single failed assault. It was recognition. Recognition that the enemy possessed the industrial depth to sustain armored combat. Recognition that early intelligence had underestimated scale. Recognition that assumptions made in Berlin had shaped plans now unraveling under pressure. German after-action reports from the period reflect this shift. Language hardened. Descriptions of American forces changed. They were no longer dismissed as negligible. They were described as numerous, persistent, and increasingly competent. The correction came too late to reverse the immediate outcome, but it altered everything that followed. The battle did not end German operations in Tunisia, but it ended the belief that American armor could be discounted. The war, from this point forward, would be fought against a materially different opponent, one that could replace what it lost, one that could learn in contact, one that German intelligence would no longer afford the luxury of underestimation. The consequences of that realization would unfold in the weeks and months ahead, measured not in reports, but in strategy. The cost becomes visible. When the fighting around Kasserine subsided, the battlefield did not resolve into clarity. It resolved into accounting. American II Corps had suffered heavy losses. Hundreds of men were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire units had been forced to withdraw under pressure. Dozens of tanks lay destroyed or abandoned across central Tunisia, their hulls blackened, their tracks twisted into the earth. For the Americans, the defeat was unmistakable. But defeat was not the full story. Despite tactical setbacks, American armored strength remained intact in aggregate. Replacement vehicles arrived quickly. Units were reconstituted rather than dissolved. The flow of material through Algerian ports continued uninterrupted. What had been lost in days was replenished in weeks. German losses were smaller numerically, but sharper in implication. Panzer divisions reported higher than expected vehicle attrition. Anti-tank units expended ammunition at rates not anticipated. Fuel consumption rose as formations maneuvered repeatedly against armored opposition that refused to disengage. Equipment wear accelerated. Field reports sent to German headquarters reflected a tonal shift. American armor was now described as present in strength and operating persistently. These phrases mattered. They signaled an adjustment in perception, if not yet in doctrine. The psychological effect on German units was subtle but real. The expectation of easy victories over American formations evaporated. Engagements became cautious. Reconnaissance intensified. Anti-tank defenses were reinforced even when facing American units alone. For American command, the aftermath triggered rapid change. General Dwight D. Eisenhower replaced key leadership within two corps. Major General George S. Patton was brought in to restore discipline and cohesion. Command relationships were clarified. Defensive depth was emphasized. Armored units were reorganized to improve combined arms coordination. None of these changes were theoretical. They were responses to contact. The Americans absorbed their defeat, not as a verdict, but as data. And data, when acted upon, reshapes outcomes. The battlefield had delivered its lesson. Both sides had paid for it, but only one had the capacity to internalize it without exhausting itself. That disparity would soon define the remainder of the campaign. That be why late February 1943, the consequences of the Kasserine engagements had spread beyond the immediate battlefield. German commanders recognized the gap between intelligence assumptions and reality. Reports from the 5th Panzer Army highlighted persistent American armored presence, efficient resupply, and adaptability under fire. The assessments no longer treated these observations as anomalies. They were systemic. Berlin responded cautiously. Senior staff revised intelligence estimates of American armor, noting not only current strength, but potential for rapid reinforcement. Logistics, previously underestimated, became a central concern. Operational plans were adjusted to factor in a sustained American armored threat rather than isolated units. Doctrinal reassessment, however, lagged behind necessity. Decision-making frameworks had been built on months of assumption. Altering them required more than acknowledgement. It required redistribution of resources already committed elsewhere. American forces, meanwhile, transformed defeat into preparation. General Patton's arrival brought rigorous retraining. Units were reorganized for tighter coordination between tanks, infantry, and artillery. Tank crews drilled movement and fire discipline. Supply chains were streamlined to maintain momentum over extended operations. The psychological shift was as significant as the tactical one. American units learned to fight with confidence, understanding that losses could be replaced and that persistence was as potent as precision. The operational tempo of subsequent engagements reflected these lessons. German armored advances met more prepared American defenses. Skirmishes became protracted. Every tank destroyed by German fire was countered by replacements arriving on the battlefield days later. The U.S. ability to sustain armored pressure forced German commanders into increasingly cautious operations. Tactical advantage, once assumed, was no longer guaranteed. Beyond Tunisia, the Kasserine experience influenced strategic calculations. German command recognized that intelligence cannot merely catalog hardware. It must anticipate adaptation, resilience, and industrial capacity. Misjudging these factors can magnify losses beyond immediate combat, forcing broader operational compromises. By March 1943, the campaign in North Africa had entered a new phase. The immediate battles of Sidi Bouzid and Kasserine Pass had reshaped expectations. For the Germans, the cost was both material and conceptual. The enemy was no longer theoretical. For the Americans, it was a crucible that hardened forces into a fighting style that could endure attrition and exploit industrial advantage. The lessons from these engagements would echo throughout the remainder of the North African campaign and beyond, where armored warfare, logistical foresight, and the capacity to learn under fire would define the conflict in concrete terms. The Kasserine Pass episode did not conclude with fanfare. There are no grand proclamations, no decisive speeches. The battlefield itself carried the truth in silence. Smoldering hulls, churned earth, and the measured cadence of units reorganizing for the next engagement. What changed in those few February days was perception. German intelligence had operated on assumption, reinforced by prior victories and incomplete observation. The encounter with American armor revealed that assumption to be insufficient. It was a structural failure, not a personal one. Misjudging an opponent's industrial depth and capacity for adaptation can have consequences far beyond any single engagement. For the Americans, the encounter was formative. Losses were absorbed, mistakes corrected, and units restructured with discipline that would define the remainder of the North African campaign. The human capacity to learn under fire, to absorb defeat without losing initiative, became a strategic advantage. Industrial might was only part of the equation. The ability to integrate it effectively into combat was equally decisive. The broader lesson is quiet but immutable. Wars are shaped as much by perception and preparation as by firepower. Assumptions that go untested become liabilities. Underestimation carries a weight measured not in theory, but in steel, smoke, and human lives. History often hinges not on grand maneuvers, but on the consequences of believing something that is not true. By the close of February 1943, the immediate clash at Kasserine Pass had passed, but its implications endured. German commanders recalibrated, American forces adapted, and the nature of armored warfare in the Mediterranean had subtly but irreversibly shifted. What the world saw as a series of engagements was, in fact, a test of perception itself, a reminder that understanding your opponent is the first and sometimes the most decisive act of war.